Yeah. Okay. So there are a few things I want to comment on there.
Yep.
So you're right about government. I mean, it needs the ability to at times do things that, do constrain liberties. There's no doubt about that. Government has a monopoly on violence, as they say.
Yep.
I agree with you there. Now, this point about getting the citizens involved, the citizens jury. Look, perhaps I think it would have been good to have done it before we got into the pandemic. Because the problem is, because of all of the fear, then the citizens jury might end up just supporting a lot of these policies. Well, I mean, I mean, the concern I would have is that a lot of these policies were driven by fear, and which to an extent, I mean, to some extent, was rational. For some people, for sure. I mean, it was certainly a serious virus. But the governments, they would argue that they were polling people, like Dan Andrews and Anastasia Palaszczuk, they were relying on opinion polling, and that was driving a lot of their policy making. So they would argue they had that legitimacy.
So I make a distinction, as I think you might know, between the opinion of the people for which I don't have a high regard and the considered opinion of the people for which I do have a high regard. So, and certainly the considered opinion of the people, I think the considered opinion of the people would have looked very like the opinion of the people early on. But if it was really fairly clear that a lot of this was the product of Project Fear, then there would be people in a citizen jury that would, the citizen jury would have powers to ask questions, to call witnesses, all that kind of stuff. And that's we spoke about this in the previous podcast we did on a different subject. The structure we have is a government that is constantly performing, is a government that is constantly performing for the satisfaction of its consumers, i.e. the voters. This is what corporations do, and what we need to do, and what we need to do is to find mechanisms for bringing ordinary people, these people who we accept are the legitimate source of democratic government, to bring them into the process and to inform them as best we can, and then ask them to deliberate, and then give the considered opinion of the people an important role in this. And it isn't just that I think it would lead to better decisions. It would lead to it does lead, when you see it being done, to a tremendously less hostile, fearful environment. The situation we were in, we had to make decisions. I don't even want to defend lockdowns. I don't want to attack them either. They were difficult decisions. You could see that I could see, and you might have seen something different, and we'll never know who's right. But I think I could see politicians doing their best, and that's a very important thing to cultivate during a crisis. And this sort of mechanism does that.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to criticise them for. I mean, I think they took it seriously. I think they were trying to do their best. I agree there. I just think there's a good case to be made that there was an overreaction. And it was because of the amount of fear, and they were making policy based on the fear at the time. Now, pre-pandemic, didn't we have all of these plans for what we would do during the pandemic, and it didn't involve half of the things that we ended up doing. So when we were looking at it rationally, and we had a different idea of what we could do. But then because of maybe there aren't enough checks and balances or constraints, there's not enough. There wasn't enough time to actually properly consider these policies. Like what we had in Queensland here, we had the government. It had a Public Health Act that it introduced in 2005, and it was thinking, we may need something like this in case there is an emergency, a pandemic. But then when we get to the actual pandemic, they're starting to worry about it all, and they're thinking, oh my God, we actually may not have all the powers we need to deal with this, and so they rush through this bill to give Jeanette Young, the Chief Health Officer at the time, all of these extra powers so she can direct individual citizens to isolate and impose lockdowns, etc. And I mean, one of the problems we've got here in Queensland, and this is why I am attracted to your idea of looking at the institutions, whatever you want to call it, the policy architecture. I like that as a concept, because one of the problems we've got here in Queensland is we don't have an upper house, which would provide some friction. Maybe it's not enough because other states have upper houses, and that didn't stop.
It wouldn't do a lot.
These policies, right. And one thing I found is that, there just wasn't enough. Our mechanisms weren't working. There wasn't enough scrutiny. I mean, spoke at a parliamentary committee here in Queensland in early 2021, and I was trying to make the case that I thought that some of the restrictions were excessive and we should look at this in a cost-benefit framework. But the only politician who actually was sympathetic was the One Nation MP, that both Labor and the coalition, or the LNP up here, they were sort of, not wanting to question anything. There was sort of a consensus view. And, I mean, I don't mind if they come to that legitimately, but I just thought there should have been more questioning in the parliament. But everyone just sort of said, oh, we're just going to, the normal mechanisms, or what we would hope would occur in a democracy, just didn't work. There wasn't enough contestability, or there wasn't enough considered development of policy.
Well, I completely agree with you, but I think I don't have a lot of hope that will arise. I don't think it's particularly easy to bring that about now, because if you look at the life of a politician, certainly a politician in a major party, they're like the major parties are kind of like battleships, manoeuvring around, getting a position on a thing, circulating their talking points, and then enforcing rigid party discipline. And when an important issue comes along that people are very emotional about, the press is doing the same thing. The press is trying to maximize clicks, report excitement. If you get up in the House and you make a speech which isn't entirely in support of your own party, and call for, and you discuss the issues, well, you're not going to get any benefits in your own party for that. The press will go through it and pick out bits of what you've just said to amp them up, and then they'll stick a microphone in front of the party leader's face and say, well, do you agree with what your backbencher said about what's going on in Logan? This is just a disastrous environment in which to get high-level discussion. And that's, again, why I'm arguing that actually people still like discussion, not on our airwaves, but in the right forums. You bring them together and they speak to each other civilly, and they try to see each other's point of view, and they try to compromise and explore their way to a common view. Now, that's almost totally absent from our politics. I think it's terrific that the Teals have done as well as they have in federal parliament, because it has set the clock back a bit. I know we're supposed to think of setting the clock back as a bad thing, but the way the Teals do electoral politics is a bit more like the way I was saying this to a Teal the other day, one of the members of parliament. It's a bit more like backbenchers were 35 years ago. They can talk about their own situation, their own concerns. They're not completely preoccupied with the talking points of their party and so on. But if we want really proper deliberation, we better try and think about how we, I was going to say route around Parliament. Well, Parliament has the power, but it's not going to, the way our society runs at the moment, there's nothing much you can do to make that discussion a search for the truth. It's a search for advantage. And so we have to try to think, how do we build institutions that cover for that allow discussion to take place, allows these processes to take place without imagining that that's going to happen in Parliament.